You gonna try it?
There.
Works?
No.
Okay.
It just turned off for some reason.
Hmm.
I didn't like what you were saying, so it just turned off.
Yeah, it's got a heresy meter on it or something.
They're censored. Thank you.
Okay. All right, what I want to do before we get too far into it, you have this sheet with you? It says commentary. Let's talk about what a parable is. Because we're going to jump right into the Good Samaritan, which is a parable. A parable is literally means something cast alongside of something else. Jesus' stories were cast alongside some sort of a truth, trying to illustrate that truth. And they had, all these parables had special meaning, and they were, but they had heavenly meaning. So we need to pay attention to that. They tend to be simple and straightforward, not with a lot of details. And they reveal, but they also conceal. They reveal truth to those who are looking for truth, and they conceal truth to those who are not looking for truth. Remember the story of Nicodemus coming to Jesus at night? And Nicodemus just couldn't see it. But we look at it and we go, I can see that. So that's what we're talking about here. Sometimes it's you could see, and sometimes you're not able to see. Because of this very purpose to reveal and conceal, it's not always easy to determine the meaning of the story. Sometimes Jesus explains it, but other times he does not. And commonly, Jesus has one main point in the parable, and we don't want to miss that point. And neither do we want to read more into the story than Jesus intended. That's always temptation for us, is to read things into the story that Jesus wasn't trying to say. Maybe making an allegory out of it or something. Okay, let's look at some of the main characters before we jump into the actual stories. First, Jesus. Jesus is called a teacher by this lawyer, but in other translations he's called master. So you know that the Greek has different understandings of what that term is. He is just celebrated with his disciples on their return from mission work. He has said, I thank you, Father. And this is interesting. Right before this parable, he has sent out the 70 to go out into the countryside and spread the word about that Jesus is coming and that these things are going to happen. And his own disciples have gone out and they've all come back joyously reporting what great success they've had. This is what Jesus says after they come back. Jesus says, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise, intelligent, and have revealed them to infants. So remember that when we read parables. A lot of the smart people, like Nicodemus, he was part of the Pharisees, and he didn't get it. But a lot of people did get it. Okay, the lawyer, another major character in this parable, is a member of the learned class in ancient Israel through New Testament times, studying the scriptures and serving as a copyist, an editor, a teacher, and a jurist. In Jewish society, there was no difference between civil law and religious law. Isn't that interesting? No difference between civil law and religious law. At the time of Christ, many of the scribes adhered to the teaching of the Pharisees. Now, with the chief priests, Sadducees, and Pharisees, the scribes composed the Jewish aristocracy of the time. and many were members of the Sanhedrin. Of course, the Sanhedrin was the governing council of the temple. They set all the laws and made sure everything was run according to the way the laws prescribed. We're going to run into a character called a priest. The book of Chronicles refers to priests as descendants of Aaron. Who was Aaron?
Moses' brother. Moses' brother.
Moses' brother, right? Remember way back in the Exodus? God told Moses to make Aaron the head of the priesthood to watch over the temple, or to watch over the tent of meeting back then. The priest of Aaron clearly acquired sole right to the Jewish priesthood. Their duties involved offering daily and holiday temple sacrifices and administering the priestly blessing to the people. A Levite. Levites were considered descendants of the tribe of Levi. Though they were those who performed subordinate services associated with public worship. In this capacity, the Levites were musicians, gatekeepers, guardians, temple officials, judges, and craftsmen. Now we run into the Samaritans. The Samaritans were a group of people that lived in the area of Israel following the Assyrian conquest. So, looking at your map again, here is Samaria, here's Judea down here, and here is Samaria. Now, before the exile of before the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom, this used to be called Israel up here, and this was called Judea down here. This was the tribe of Judah, and these were all the other tribes up in here. Assyria came down from the north, conquered this part, took them, most of them, off into exile. But some were left. Some were left. Those that were left intermarried with some of the Assyrians over many hundreds of years. They came to believe that the only books of the Hebrew Bible that they would worship in were the 5 books of Moses. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers. Okay? So all the prophets, all the other books of the Hebrew Bible, they did not believe in. So those two things, that they had intermarried with some of the pagans and that they didn't believe in all the scriptures that the Hebrew, they were heretics to the Jewish people. And they were hated by the Jewish people. The Jews considered them unclean. And then finally there was the victim of the robbers that we'll read about in this story. The victim in the story is not characterized at all, not by race or religion, region or trade. He's merely a certain man who by implication could be any one of the people who heard this story. Anybody could put themselves in that position. So let's look at a couple of themes before we get into the reading of this parable. Jesus just affirmed that no one knows the Father but the Son. And now he's challenged to interpret what one must do for eternal life. Life in God's kingdom, the age to come. Jesus has declared that God has hidden wisdom from the wise. Now Jesus is questioned by one of the wise, a scribe. Remember what we talked about earlier, that things are going to be hidden from the wise and revealed to infants. So Jesus is going to be questioned by one of these wise folks. And Remember what we're going to read in this parable. What does the wise folks say? Well, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? He's going to find out. Well, Jesus has praised the disciples for what they had seen. Remember, they had all come back from going out around the countryside, spreading the word about Jesus. Now they came back. Jesus has praised them for what they had seen. Now he tells a story in which 3 men see a man in a ditch, but only the Samaritan stops to help them. And having established the priority of loving God and loving one's neighbor, Jesus tells a story about being a neighbor. And Jesus adds a story about a woman who breaks the rules by listening to Jesus' teaching while her sister works in the kitchen. Neither the lawyer or Martha understand Jesus. The 2 stories therefore illustrate the scandal that radical obedience to Jesus' commands require what it requires. And that's why these 2 stories are put together like this. Because it's really interesting that we have these 2 stories together in a travel narrative. Because why would Jesus be up in Capernaum down here? Where do we remember? Do you remember anything from previous studies about where Mary and Martha lived with their brother Lazarus?
Bethany.
Bethany, right? And where is Bethany? Bethany is right here. There's 2 Bethanys. There's one in this area across the Jordan, but that's not the one we're talking about. Here's Bethany here. And see how close it is to Jerusalem? It's just right, really, across the mountain. Very close. So, you've got a story where Jesus is up here telling the story about the Good Samaritan, and all of a sudden, boom, now he's down here. Now, I'm thinking Luke is trying to make a point, and he maybe doesn't really care about this happened here this time and this happened this time. He's trying to put these things together to make a point about who Jesus is. So we're going to see Jesus jumping around all over the place. Now it could be he was down here for a festival or something, you know, maybe for the some festival. Jesus traveled back and forth to Jerusalem a lot. If it was a 3-year ministry, Jesus was a good Jew. He's going to go to at least 3 festivals a year, which one would be the Passover. So he would be coming back and forth to Jerusalem. So it may be on one of those trips. Here's another thing to remember too, as we move into this story. A good Jew is not going to go in Samaria. It's terrible for them to go through there because they're a bunch of heretics, so they don't want to have anything to do with them. So how they would travel would be from Capernaum. They would come down the Jordan River on the eastern bank, and then come back up here and then up to Jerusalem from Jericho. So they would come down this way over to Jericho and then up to Jerusalem. Up to Jerusalem, because it's 3,200 feet above Jericho. Jericho is below sea level, so they had to travel up to get to Jerusalem or down. Let's look at this. The way they traveled was through what is known as the Wadi Kelt, Q-E-L-T, Kelt. This is the wilderness. When we hear about the wilderness of that Jesus spent time in the wilderness, we think of it being like a flat desert. but it's not. It's desert mountains. Desert mountains. But if you can see right here, this is a gorge that runs through these mountains where the water, when they did have huge rains, would drain down from the top of the mountain down to the bottom. When we took this picture, we were looking into the Wadi Kelt, which is this part right here. Here it is again, running down, and here is Jericho down here. This is the place where Jesus is talking about where the man would have been robbed and beaten. It just happened all the time because people were constrained to this little path that ran through these mountains. There was a spring in there that they could get water from. And so robbers had a tendency to hang out in that area and to attack people. And so this would be the area that Jesus would be talking about. And this, what's amazing about standing in this spot, looking down there, that's where Jesus would have walked, is down in that wadi. That's the one that runs from Jerusalem to Jericho. There's no other way to get to Jericho in that time than through that wadi. And so, the story that we're going to read would have had a lot of meaning for the people. All right? Any questions so far?
Did the Jews still feel the same way about the people in Samaria today?
No, I think that well, maybe some of the really Orthodox Jews do, but believe it or not,
Do the Jews still live in Samaria, or is it mainly Palestinians?
it's in the West Bank now.
Okay.
Yeah, but there's no Jews living there, but there are Samaritans. There are still people that worship the same way the Samaritans did. They only believe in the first 5 books of the books of Moses. They have a holy mountain that they worship on, Mount Gerizim, right here. And they have other traditions, some similar to the Jewish traditions and some not. But yeah, there's not many, but there are still some there. Okay, let's look at this parable now. Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, and passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you need." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." Now, when they went on their way, he entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him to her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks, so she came to him and asked, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her." Let's look at the rest of our commentary before we get into these questions, because I think this kind of puts a little frame around what we're going to be doing. When questioned by the lawyer about how to inherit eternal life, Jesus asked the lawyer to interpret the law himself. His answer reflects the injunctions of the Ten Commandments by combining duty to God with duty to neighbor, and echoes Jesus' own summary of the law. The answer is correct, but Jesus adds an important concept to it. Do this and you will live. It's not enough to know the law. With Jesus, words and deeds are one. And to do the law is to live. We need to think about that, you know. What does that mean for us, too? The story of the Good Samaritan underscores Jesus' admonition to the lawyer. When faced with human suffering and immediate need, those who only know the law pass by. In contrast, the Samaritan, a foreigner, much despised by the Jews as a religious heretic, embodies the living demands of the law. Here's an important sentence. God's law finds fulfillment in acts of love, and God's kingdom is open to all who combine knowing and doing. Yeah, like most societies in first century Judaism, it was ordered by boundaries with specific rules that regarded how the Jews should treat Gentiles, Samaritans, and how priests should relate to the Israelites, how men should treat women, and so on. All those rules were because the boundaries allowed for these groups to establish their positions, their power, their privilege, and maintaining those boundaries was vital to that particular social order that they lived in. It was their religious duty to maintain that order. Neither the story of the Good Samaritan nor the story of Martha and Mary is complete without the other. That's why they're put together this way. Luke was very intentional about the way he did this. Each makes its own point. The Samaritan loves his neighbor. Mary loves her Lord. But the model for the disciple is found in the comparison of the two. To the lawyer, Jesus says, "Go and do," but he praises Mary for sitting and listening. Life in faith requires both of those things. That's what Luke's trying to tell us. We've got to do both of those things. The power of the story consists not just in that they exemplify the commands of verse 27, but in Jesus' choice of the characters to illustrate the love of neighbor and God. A Samaritan and a woman. The social codes and boundaries were clear and inflexible. A Samaritan would not be considered a model of neighborliness, and a woman would not sit with men at the feet of a teacher. Both of those things were outside the bounds of what normal society would have been. In its own way, the combining of these stories about the Samaritan and the female disciple emphasizes Jesus' protest against the rules and the boundaries that the culture in which he lived set. These two stories expose the injustice of social barriers that categorize, restrict, and oppress various groups in society: Samaritans, victims, and women. To love God with all one's heart and one's neighbor as oneself meant that then and now that one must often reject society's rules in favor of the codes of the kingdom. A society without distinctions and boundaries between its members. The rules of that society are just two: to love God and love one's neighbor. But these rules are so radically different from those of most societies in which we live that living by them invariably calls us to disregard all else, break rules, and follow Jesus' example. That's kind of radical, right? Radical stuff. So let's look at our questions, see if we can answer some of these. The lawyer quotes the Shema from Deuteronomy 6:4-9, and what I should have put down here, and also from Leviticus 19:18, because that's the neighbor part of that. Why would you think the Shema places the three loves in that order? God, neighbor, and yourself. Why do you think they're in that order? Yes, Chrissy?
Well, I think because obedience has been emphasized.
Because what?
Obedience to God has been emphasized.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because they have to do, the Samaritans have to do it every day. And it's God, neighbor, and themselves. And
I think the order is really important.
And with God, then we're better able to serve our neighbor.
There you go.
Love ourselves.
That's right. Yeah, you got to love God first before you can do the other ones, right? In verse 28, Jesus says something that should give the lawyer pause. Why? In verse 28, Jesus said, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live."
Well, he obviously knows the law. He knows what it says.
Yes,
So he needs to live it out.
that's right. Yeah, he's kind of putting it right in the lawyer's face. Do it. Yeah, you know it. Now go and do it, and you'll live.
It's that follow through. It's the difficult part.
That's right. That's right. And it's interesting. What excuse would you think the lawyer and the Levite temple priest would give for passing the injured man? Well, before we get to that, I'm going to go back to this again. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped this one. The lawyer's question in verse 29 and Jesus' answer in 36 don't quite match up. What's the difference?
The lawyer's trying to justify his own behavior,
Yeah.
so to speak, racist behavior.
Yeah, and you can almost just say Jesus is saying in 28, do this and you will live. And so now he's going to try to wiggle out of it. What do you mean do this? What do you want me to do? Who's my neighbor? And what do you think the lawyer really wanted Jesus to say about who his neighbor was? And remember,
Like to help people like yourself.
yes, right. Remember we talked about that lawyers, the scribes, the Pharisees, all wanted to maintain that social order. That social order was bounded by, they were all Jews. So my neighbor is going to be just like me. He's going to be a Jew, right? Well, that's going to say something to us about who's our neighbor too, you know? Who's our neighbor? Maybe it's not just people that look like us. Maybe it's not just people that act like us. Maybe it's somebody outside of what we would consider our particular way of living.
Well, the lawyer didn't have pity or mercy.
What's that?
The lawyer didn't have pity or mercy. Understand?
What excuse would you think the lawyer and the Levite would give for passing the injured man?
He was unclean,
Unclean, right?
they were too busy.
But too busy?
Didn't have time.
Yeah.
Common occurrence.
You know what, though? There was no excuse. Because a Levite and a priest, if they saw a dead body, they were supposed to bury a dead body. It didn't matter if they were going to be unclean or not. There were precepts about caring for people who were injured or something. You know, they might have made the excuse that I was going to be unclean, but that was not a good excuse. No excuse. Why is it so shocking to hear that the Samaritan had stopped and tended to the man's wounds?
They were the enemies of the Jews.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was just, you know, you can imagine a Jewish audience hearing this. They would have been shocked that a Samaritan would have done this because of those things that we talked about before, that they were heretics and unclean. What excuse would we give today to pass by someone in desperate need?
Someone else will do it.
Yes, well, that's a good one too. Yeah, it's not my job. Yeah. What
Might be a
excuse?
street person or.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Afraid to jump
Yeah,
in there.
fear, a lot of fear. A lot of it is
I
fear.
don't have the time.
Yeah, busy.
That's why we have social services. Let the government do it.
That's right. Which goes back to it's not my job. You got somebody that'll take care of that. You know, it's, yeah. The fear angle is really a big one too. What else? What other ways could we act like the priest and the Levite?
Just don't want to get involved.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, and in this day and time, the fear of being sued.
Oh,
I
yeah,
mean, it just seems like there's a
Yeah.
lawyer on every corner.
yeah. And we're usually busy, right? I mean, we have places we have to be and things we have to do, and to stop and take the time to do that.
I find so often, not even total strangers, but people I care about, and I have a nudge in my mind, whatever the issue is, to do something.
Yeah.
And well, I'll get to that. And then it's too late. And then so often, you just, you pass the opportunity, it's too late.
Yeah. Yes, yes.
Well, I don't imagine the priest or the holy man or whatever having any of these feelings, because his paramount feeling would be that he was being righteous, that he was doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing and following the law, and that he was justified in his action.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Especially
all
if he was
these
worried
other
about
things
being
that Probably
unclean.
would occur to us.
Mhm.
You know, his mindset was different.
Yeah.
Probably right.
I wonder if we could feel that way too, the same way that he did. If we, you know, if we viewed somebody as possibly a criminal or somebody that was outside of society some way, and we looked at them and said, I'm not going to help that guy. He deserves what he gets, you know. I've got things to do, you know. I can see that.
You look at the people on the street, you think, well, if I give them money, they're just gonna buy drugs.
Yeah,
But that's
yeah.
not necessarily the case. You know,
Yeah.
But you don't know.
Yeah.
I look at them and say, okay, you look like you're able enough to have a job, so you should go. work.
That's
And
right. Boy,
That's probably not what I
that's
should
right.
be doing.
I know. I think this parable, Jesus makes us think about how we treat people. And, you know, are we going to change the way we do things? I don't know. But we need to at least be confronted with it, you know. Because a lot of people in our society aren't confronted with it at all. They just walk by, you know. At least we need to at least think about how we treat those that are outside the margins of society. When Martha invited Jesus into her home, what was she doing as compared to what her sister Mary was doing?
She was being the typical hostess, getting everything ready, and her sister wanted just to listen to Jesus. I
Mhm.
mean, I think we all are guilty of that.
Yeah,
Women,
yeah.
you know, we tend to busy ourselves so much.
Yeah, Martha was doing what the society at that time told her that she had to do. And you know, in many households in the Arab-speaking world, that's still the case. Women have to stay in a certain part of the house, and if men are there, they are not to come into the room unless they're serving something or invited, but they have to stay in the part. So that culture still lives in some parts of our world today.
My Bible has a commentary on this whole thing, and I thought it was good. It calls her a doer and a seeker. So there was Martha doing, and then the seeker was Mary.
That's right, that's right. How was Mary's behavior countercultural for women of those times?
So she normally wouldn't be sitting at the feet of the teacher.
There's a part of Jewish lore called the Mishnah. It's like a commentary on their Hebrew scriptures where they tell stories and they give interpretations. And one of the things in the Mishnah says this: "Let thy house be a meeting place for the sages, and sit amidst the dust of their feet, and drink in their words with thirst, but talk not much to womankind." That's what it says, yeah. There was a culture. There was a culture. Mary was inserting herself into a place in that culture which was exclusively reserved for men and for disciples, both who were considered the same thing. Now, what did Martha assume about Jesus and her sister in her anxiety?
She thought he would agree with her, and she came and complained.
Yeah. Martha felt that Jesus and her sister really didn't care about how important the thing was that she was doing. Martha cares about fulfilling her duties, and that has thrown her life into disorder. All of that has prevented her from attending to Jesus' teaching. They have prevented her from unhindered devotion to God. Martha is anxious about many things, but only one thing is needed. This is a reminder that the duty of the love of God and the obedience to God's word takes precedent over all concerns. How can assumptions or personal agendas impact relationship with others and with Jesus? How can assumptions and personal agendas impact relationship with others and with Jesus?
My
Just
list
thinking
can,
about yourself.
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Just thinking, you're just thinking about yourself.
Yeah, right, yeah, yeah.
And my list is more important than any other thing.
Mm-hmm. We're all busy, right? And we all got things we got to do. Sometimes we don't take the time to sit at Jesus' feet. To sit at Jesus' feet for us would be what? What would that look like?
Being still and know that He is God.
Be still and know that He is God. It's good. Yeah, what else?
Prayer,
Mm-hmm.
study,
Taking a few minutes for morning prayer, right? To just sit and
Read the Bible.
read the Bible, right? All these things are places that we can sit at Jesus' feet. Just take a moment out of our busy lives to sit at His feet. Take a moment out of our Martha lives, right? What good portion did Mary choose, and why will it never be taken away? Why will it never be taken away?
She would have it as a memory forever, her relationship and her visit.
That relationship with Jesus, yeah, yeah. By choosing to attend to Jesus' teaching while laying everything aside, Mary exemplifies, listen to this, Mary exemplifies what it means to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. As if to affirm Mary's radical violation of Jewish social roles, Jesus adds that what she has chosen will not be taken away from her. Jesus is really pushing the boundaries when he says that her being there is where she needs to be.
Was this Mary considered one of his disciples?
Could be, you could consider that. I mean, yeah. Both Martha and Mary, remember, and Lazarus were there. That was the closest friends Jesus had. What similarities do you see between the lawyer and the priest in our first story and in Martha in the second story? And you might think about Mary and the Samaritan. What similarities and differences do you see?
Well, they both believed that they were doing the right thing,
Right?
according to what they understand their priorities were from God.
Mm-hmm.
Incorrectly, but that's what they believed.
What about Mary and the Samaritan?
I think also it kind of reflects people do what's really deep in their hearts.
Yeah.
Your actions
Mm-hmm.
tell more about you, what's inside of you, than you want to reveal.
Boy, isn't that the truth?